Well, today we're going to talk about when does it make sense to outsource compliance, or like why some people decide to do that. So, one of the first things that I'd preface on is a lot of our advice and a lot of our perspective, right, is going to be based off of serving customers who are in the 20 to 200 employee space, typically don't have a lot of IT security staff. And so a lot of things that we're going to talk about today are not for people that are at 10,000 people, or even really at a 5-person company either. It's really for people who are kind of in that more like SMB type space where typically compliance is coming up for the first time. You know, maybe you've been around for a while, you've hit 50 employees, maybe you're at, somewhere between 5 to 10 million in revenue, and now you're sort of getting into the big leagues of a couple of big deals coming your way. Or perhaps you do business with the government and you just have a really big contract with Boeing or any of the other, let's call it primes or subprimes. So yeah, you want to get us started, Joseph?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously that's an important preface. The logic behind the preface is that typically those size of companies have the staffing and the bandwidth and the expertise to be able to handle this appropriately. So you could totally be a 500 person organization and it would still be in your best interest to outsource compliance, because maybe you're a 500 person organization that just doesn't have those roles because
No,
you've
I've seen
never
that
needed
before.
to, right?
Yeah,
But on average, typically, you don't need to outsource compliance at that stage. It's still worth a conversation. You should still do your due diligence. But it's just to say that what we're going to be talking about today is not absolute,
sure,
mandate for people to
sure,
do. There's gray area involved, but just take it
of
with a grain
course.
of salt and try to think through your individual circumstances. I think that the first thing that is important to note whenever we think about outsourcing compliance is, first of all, why would you want to do that? The main reason that people will think about outsourcing compliance is because you just don't have the expertise in staff, right? So you have to go and get something like a SOC 2 or a CMMC or an ISO 27001, and you just have nobody at the company who's ever done that before.
Yeah,
So going and trying to do it for your first time is going to be a huge learning experience. And typically, whenever you're at the stage where you need to go and get something like CMMC or ISO 27001, you already have a very valid reason. If you want more on that, we've done podcasts on that before about just the
you're
rationale.
not just doing this for fun.
You're not just doing it for fun, right? You're doing it because there's a concrete business need, and typically there's a lot of revenue attached to it.
And
And
typically
so,
there's a timeline.
in a timeline, exactly.
Yeah.
So, if you don't have the expertise, then the company is not a training grounds for going and learning how to do that, at least the first go round, right? Now, later on, once you've already achieved it and your current staff has been there through the process and sort of seen how things are going and they have something to inherit, then it can be a different story. But at least for the initial go round, if you don't have any expertise on hand, nobody's ever done this before, it's not a good idea to practice when there's a lot of revenue attached to it.
What do you mean by expertise? Like, what type of roles are typically, and maybe not even the roles, they're, let's call it IT ops. So if you can touch on that, but maybe also touch on the, like, beyond the role, what specific skill sets would you need to be successful with this?
First main thing that is often lacking at smaller mid-sized organizations is just the security expertise. So the majority of the controls, not all of them, obviously there's more to it than just security, but a lot of the work that you're going to be doing in trying to successfully pass a CMMC or ISO audit for the first time is going to just be setting up the security infrastructure that is adhering to those controls to begin with. And so many companies don't have dedicated security engineers on staff. It's maybe an IT manager or IT operations person, help desk person, something like that. So if you don't have somebody who has security experience, they may run into some issues in trying to go and deploy all of these things in order to be within compliance for the first time. So there's that piece. In addition to that, it's not just knowing the security work itself, but it's also knowing how to interpret the framework properly and then knowing what to go and do with it as a result. So this may touch like an operations type of level. You may have like a GRC manager or someone like that who's had experience doing this before. But essentially, if you're looking at an ISO 27001 audit, you're going to need to know how to take the requirements in order to pass that audit and translate it to your business. So the GRC platforms like Adrado or Vanta, for example, can help you out with that a little bit because you're able to plug in your infrastructure and sort of see
Right.
where the gaps are in an objective way, and then there's descriptions next to it and things like that. Your auditor can also help to walk you through that to a certain extent, but being able to have the experience and knowing how do I translate this into this business specifically, and then stay on top of that and create project plans and things to make sure that gets done, that's an endeavor in and of itself. So it's not just the actual implementation work of security and that sort of thing, but it's also just the whole interpreting the framework and implementing it at the company and documenting it, creating policies specific to the organization. Those are things that can trip a lot of people up.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed, and we've brought this up in a separate episode about should the devs be in charge of this, and where a lot of the security engineers and the devs kind of, get tripped up is the whole like non-technical pieces of such as like the drafting the policies. And yes, the GRC platforms do a great job of like automating a lot of like the template generation for those policies, which is a huge time saver. But your typical IT manager wants to be like in PowerShell scripts. They want to be in, ConnectWise. They want to be in the tools, and they really are like more geeky type of people who love just playing with the tools. And they really typically don't like following process, is from my experience. They like to just go do what they want to go do in the tools and have fun setting up all the security stuff, setting up all the fun toys, right? But like drafting the policies, having to like go get buy-in from all the different people of like, all right, well, how does this policy affect you? And then also ensure that you are operating in a way that adheres to those policies, right? I actually have to have a change management process now when I do my IT work. It's like most IT managers don't really want to do that. So I feel like the second part of the expertise is really having that like an operations person who is going to lead the initiative, right? I find that it's often unsuccessful when the IT person by themselves leads the initiative. It's often much more successful when one, there's an operations person or even more senior technical person like a CTO, right? Who, yes, they're technical, but like they lead the entire organization so that they can translate the process, because most of the, let's call it, the implementers don't want to be touching that stuff.
Yes. I also think there's something to be said about specialization. We've seen a lot of organizations that say, well, this person's technical, they can figure it out. And oftentimes they can, but the real question is, should they? Because if that person specializes in, let's say, dev work, for example, technically they can probably figure some things out to get you there, but that's not what they specialize in. And so it's a bigger discussion in terms of like, is that person going to be happy doing that? Is that fulfilling for them? Is that where they want their skills to go? So there's things to consider from just the staffing perspective.
I remember there was a company that you talked to, I want to say like 2 weeks ago, where the guy told you, hey, I actually left my last company because they gave me all this compliance stuff and like I didn't want to do it, right? Or he ended up having to do it, and then he like left afterwards because he's like, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah, he literally was. He's a developer by trade, right? Now he's CTO, but he's like, yeah, I'm talking to you guys because I literally went through this at my last company, and not again. It's not going to happen again. So yeah, you need to sort of take that into consideration. I mean, if you're trying to get good at a specific thing, and I would argue that being good at compliance is worth it, right? Because the whole point of compliance is that not only are you having some sort of security objective standard that you're following, but it's also in your best interest from a revenue generation and protection standpoint once you're dealing with mid-market enterprise customers or specific agencies or parts of the government to go and get this done. So the question shouldn't be, how do I skirt by and do this? The question should be, shoot, man, if I have $10 million that is attached to this from a business standpoint, doesn't it make sense to specialize in that, right? Like,
yeah.
if you're going to go and get surgery done, like, don't you want to work with a specialist who's sort of done this before instead of just saying, well, my GP can take care of this, right? Maybe, like, they're smart, but wouldn't you want to go with a specialist to go and get this
Sure.
done? So I think it's all of this is always going to tie down to the business case and the business impact, no
Yeah.
matter what. Like, there's no way to escape it. So we also want to keep that very present in the conversation, that when we think about outsourcing it, it's not like an ego exercise or anything like that. Yeah, you might be able to do it, but you got to think about, how does this make sense logically from the business standpoint?
Right.
And in many cases, it doesn't make sense to invest in this
Yeah.
in-house.
Yeah. I feel like that has a really nice leeway into point number 2. So we just talked about expertise. Point number 2 is really about time, right? So oftentimes when companies are going through this, there's some sort of time element to this. If this was just added on your plate as an initiative for fun because you think we should go do this, then your company sucks. You should really only be doing this if there's a true business need and you're going to go win a hefty amount of money. And the timing element of that is oftentimes there is some sort of contractual obligation to where you don't necessarily have to be SOC 2 or ISO today, but oftentimes the vendor, if the vendor really wants to work with you, they're going to work with you, even if you don't have it, right? If they really, really, really want to work with you, or maybe you're the only vendor in the space that you do something super niche, and the only person who can do it, right? There aren't a lot of other substitutes. Then they will work with you. However, I've seen it many times to where in the sales contract, this actually happened with one of our customers like last year. They won a $12 million contract, and they in that contract, they were asked to become ISO 27001. Within the next 12 months. Right? $12 million, great. But in the next 12 months, there's a lot of risk of like trying to do something yourself when you know that at renewal, it could risk the deal, right? Sure. Could at renewal, they could be like, maybe you could prove like, maybe I'm a SOC 2 type 1 or whatever. But in this case, they chose ISO, which is far more challenging and prescriptive than a SOC 2 is, and especially like compared to like a SOC 2 type 1. So there's not as much leeway. And so the timing element is very important because if you need to have it done within a certain time frame, there's a lot of risk in trying to do it yourself when you don't know what you don't know.
Sure. It's also very important whenever you're even thinking about take it in-house or external type of decision, to do the gap analysis at the beginning, right?
Yes.
Because all of what we're talking about, I mean, if you're already 80% of the way there because you've done a lot of the work right that fit within these frameworks to begin with, then sure, like, you could risk it because you have 12 months to go 20%. So a lot of it is just trying to get a good understanding and be honest with yourself of where you're starting from. And if you have a long ways to go, then it's inherently much more risky to try and take it yourself, because now you know that you have much less leeway to mess up. Right? You have to be on point. And that's especially true with things like SOC 2 Type 2, right? Where you need to have a certain observation period. So the work has to be done before you even start the observation period. So
right.
If they want that attestation Type 2 within 12 months, well then your actual window to get the work done is much smaller, because you need to factor in for the window for actually showing that you're maintaining it. So that's something to consider as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of milestones to this, right? And it's a lot of milestones, and it's a lot of it is, it's like, how much can you show the vendor that's requesting this that you're putting in the effort so that they sort of just let you go, right? I think with SOC 2, I should say with both like MSPs, managed service providers, as well as the auditors, one of the things that often comes up is attestation letters, right? I've seen a lot of customers get away with being able to sign those deals by simply having an attestation letter from both the MSP as well as the auditor saying that, like, we are engaged. That's sort of like the very first step. I think if you're doing let's call it a SOC 2 Type 2, by example, there's sort of a lot of milestones that you could do to prove to your customer that you are taking the steps. The first one is attestation letters. The second piece is a SOC 2 Type 1. SOC 2 Type 1 you could potentially do far, far earlier. maybe within the first 2 to 3 months of engagement, maybe even month one in engagement, depending on how far you are from an implementation perspective. And then obviously the final one is the SOC 2 Type 2, right? So there's a lot of different milestones in between. Obviously, you can also show pen tests. You can show, if you have a GRC platform, you can even show how far along you are, like your score within Adrada or Vanta. So there's lots of things that you can show that can ease the process that might not make it a hard 12-month deadline. But it's very possible that some other vendors are just going to say, sorry, it is what it is. You got to go get your piece of paper, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say outside of just the expertise and the time component, we also need to factor in just the amount of juggling that has to take place in order to do this. Because it's very different from saying, okay, I know exactly what I need to accomplish, and I'm going to block my calendar to do X, Y, Z. There's something else to be said about just the juggling act throughout the organization that has to take place. So you may be technically skilled and you may have the time, but you may not want to have to, what we've heard a lot of times colloquially called as cat herd, all of the different pieces of things, because that in and of itself can become a headache to have to deal with.
Yeah.
So
what are some of those pieces?
So you have obviously the GRC platform, right? You're going to have to procure it, implement it, plug all your things into it, and go and do the work within the platform. You have the external audit, obviously, that has to take place. So you have to engage with an auditor. You're going to have back and forth with the auditor. They're going to be requesting evidence. They're going to be doing all sorts of things that they're going to request from you. You have also, for certain frameworks, you might have the internal audit that you're going to have to set up and take care of. There's all of the different tools. Let's say that you have different gaps for the tools. Procure the tools, implement the tools. So you have that to worry about. Within the compliance frameworks, there's a lot of things that touch HR, operations, the board, leadership team, etc. So you're going to have some sort of project management skills to be able to tie all those things together. So it's not just necessarily about, do I know how to do this? And do I have the time to dedicate to this within, 12-month period or whatever, but it's just the inherent juggling act that has to take place that you may just not want to deal with, right?
Right. And oftentimes, if you're doing this for the first time, like it's one thing if you're already SOC 2 and now you're going after another framework, but oftentimes when people are coming to us, they've never done this before at all, right? And so they oftentimes think that to become compliant, the sequence of events is buy a GRC platform, engage with auditor, done, right? And oftentimes we have to educate them or kind of uncover, or they naturally uncover that there's a lot more to it. If depending on the framework, if things like a backup policy, right? Well, do you have a cloud backup tool? Do you have something that's hooked up to your Microsoft 365? Do you have a cloud backup solution? Do you have a password vault? Or are you using like a 1Password, a LastPass, a Keeper, right? So there's policies that have to do with all those things and controls that have to do with, there are some controls that are easily aligned or like simply aligned to a particular category of tools, like cloud backup solutions and so forth, or like a know before security awareness training, right? So there's some tools that align very clearly with those things. Or again, we've talked about MDM a lot, so Intune, Jamf, Managed Engine and of the sort. And depending on the others, there's also, again, like you said, the internal audit, there's the pen testing, right? So there's a lot of different pieces that people often don't know about these things. And they don't realize it's like, oh, wow, I thought I was just getting these two things. And suddenly it's like, I need help with MSP. I need help with the Microsoft stuff. I don't have a pen test. Well, what tool do I use for that, right? Like now you got to do all the research, right? So imagine you have to go meet with 2 to 3 sales reps, right, of each of these product categories. You're going to meet with Adrada and Avanta and maybe a Secure Frame. You're going to meet with Sensiba and A-Line and Insight Assurance. You're going to go meet with Keeper and LastPass. Right? If you don't have any of these things, again, it all comes down to like your maturity level from like an IT, from the business maturity level, right? If you don't have any of those things and you're doing it all on your own, you're about to meet with like 20 different sales reps, right? And then you have to choose a solution. Once you decide on the solution, you got to go implement the solution, right? So it's a lot of things to coordinate.
For sure. There's a lot of moving parts, especially, you have to go, and a lot of things that people don't like to do is go chase down people to sign the policies or to complete the security awareness training. There's a lot of the more in the mud types of things that have to be done as well. And so depending on who you have on hand, going back to the whole, who do you have staff and what are their specialization, they might not necessarily like being the ones that have to go and do that, right? It's
Yeah.
like,
Creating the deck for the board meeting on the annual SOC 2 review, right? It's like all things that you're like, wait, I have to do this?
yeah, I mean, it's kind of like you're trying to build a car. The car, you're going to need the transmission, you're going to need the engine, you're going to need the drivetrain. There's like the AC system. It's like, yeah, you're looking at a car, but there's much more to it than just the car from the outside perspective, right? There's all the subsystems that make that car what
Right.
it is that is really pretty analogous to doing compliance, right? It's like, sure, my objective is the SOC 2, but all of the little bits and pieces that have to go into it, over 100 controls, right? Just for security alone. That's the stuff where when you're thinking about how am I going to manage this workload over the course of a year, you may be spending 2 weeks on this, 1 week on that, 3 weeks on this, and it's the huge list of things that have to go and get developed and set up
Right.
properly that for most people is just a headache.
Yeah. And even if you know how to go do it, you might not just be implementing it. You might have to go communicate with the whole team. All right, guys, this Friday I'm doing this. You're going to see this new edition thing, right? Like they're things that also like touch the end user. And even if you do have the tools, I've also seen people who already have like the ticketing systems, right? A very common thing that happens when you go after these compliance frameworks is you integrate your ticketing platform, like a Jira, Zendesk type of thing, with your GRC platform, so that all of your tasks that you have to go do are integrated with your with your ticketing system, so that you can go assign the work and kind of have those automated workflows as you maintain it into year two, right? And so oftentimes, yes, you might have Jira or Zendesk, but you don't have the specific tags. There's like the specific, properties that you then have to go configure because, you probably weren't using the ticketing system for this specific use case. And so now there's additional fields you want to go collect. Then there's like dashboards, right? So when you go through the audit, the auditing process, and you have to show that you are proactively and programmatically taking care of these tasks and you're not just doing everything the day before the audit. Well, a really good way to do that is plug the ticket, your ticketing system into a BI tool like a Tableau or a Power BI or and such, to then display how good the team is at assigning the tickets and resolving them, the ones that have to do with security and compliance, and then being able to show and demonstrate to the auditor that you are proactively going after these things. So there's potentially a lot of like work to do, even if you also have the tools. There's a lot of like new dashboards you're going to go create, new ticketing fields that you're going to go create, because you simply just haven't used, because I should say, from the outside perspective of the auditor, they don't know how you work, right? They don't have access to all your stuff. So like you have to prove to this person that you've never met before that you run the business well, right? From a IT, security, operations, HR perspective, right? And so the more you can do to make it easy for them to find the evidence and show that you do this process correctly, the easier time you're going to have, right? Because you can have a really easy audit. You can also have a really bad audit, right? You can still pass in either way. You can still pass. You can still get the piece of paper. You can still get your attestation, right? All that stuff. But a lot of it can also be like, how involved is the audit, right? So there's a lot of work that you may not do internally because you've never done it before. So you've never thought about, oh, wow, I should do this time. You might think about it a year later or 18 months later, versus like an agency might have all of the built out reports and ticketing stuff all resolved already, so that everything is plug and play, so that by the time it gets to the auditor's like, oh wow, you guys are extremely well prepared, and the audit goes a lot smoother.
There's a lot less back and forth. There's a lot less having to go and dig up evidence and things like that. I think it's also helpful maybe at this point to talk about the number of hours and to quantify this a little bit, because we're not just speaking theoretically here. Like
Sure.
we've done time studies before, and we also have data from some of the platforms like Drata that can attest to this. So what we see is that most of the organizations, by a wide margin, are spending at least 1,000 hours on this per year, and 40% are spending at least 5,000 hours. So when we think about an FTE, they're going to give you around 1,500 workable productive hours per year when you factor out vacation, sick time, internal meetings, etc. And so if your current staff is already busy doing what they're doing today, think about the ramifications if you tack an additional 1,000, 2,000 hours on top of them, right? It's worth thinking about. And that's unfortunately what does happen at a lot of companies is that they say, well, this fits within IT, so you go figure it out. Yeah. Not recognizing the extra amount of workload that it's going to take for that person or for that group to be able to pull this off effectively. So we talk to a lot of IT managers who are starting early, working late, working weekends, working holidays and things like that to meet these deadlines because the planning was not done properly to be able to identify the amount of extra workload this would add to that team's plate when it could have been a simple outsourcing conversation that would have been in the best interests of the organization. And like we talked about before, some people leave the company after that. So
yeah. And 1,000 hours is on like the light end. I've seen it. I believe it's in, I want to say it's in Gerada's 2023, 2024 report where they said like the range is, it's something like 75% of companies that have to go after these frameworks spend between 1,000 hours and 10,000 hours per year on this. And so that basically equates to, let's call it somewhere between 2 to 5 headcounts, give or take. If you're in the 20 to 200 employee range, I would say you're probably closer to you're probably more at the maybe the 3.5 headcount, which is what, call it 5,000 hours. And obviously there's certain elements of the 5,000 hours or so that you may already be doing. You may not, right? If you already have an IT manager, it's very possible that 1,500 of those hours are already being done and you plug in Drata for the first time or Vanta for the first time and you're already at 50% to the framework. Very possible. It's also very possible that you buy a GRC platform, like many of the people that we engage with, and you do nothing with it for 6 months to 9 months, and you're talking to the CSM of that company, and they're like, oh, shit, they literally haven't even touched the tool, right?
Yeah. That's a reality, unfortunately. And I think it helps to understand the number of hours because then it makes the cost conversation much more simple. Because what we're able to do is say, well, how much am I paying per hour to my current people, and how many extra hours would this take versus outsourcing it? I think that can oftentimes help. So from a cost perspective, in the vast majority of cases that we see, outsourcing it to a service like ours or a similar service or whatever will save you about 50% or more on the labor cost that goes into this. So it's not just about it being easier. It's not just about, the expertise, making sure it's done right the first time, anything like that. There's also a very real cost conversation that's associated with this where typically people will say, well, I already have people that are doing this, right? But it's worth looking at cost because that person is already tasked with doing certain things as part of their job responsibility. And this is an additional workload on top of that. We need to be looking at that portion specifically and understanding, is it a better use of that person's time, which leads into our next point later. Is it a better use of this person's time to keep focusing on the dev work, which I'm paying them $60 an hour for? Or
$60 an hour? Dude, I think you're paying devs a lot more. What is that? I don't know. What is that?
Could be a lot more. I'm using 60 as, junior dev.
60 times 40 times 52. Geez, yeah, okay, 100K, yeah, maybe if you're hiring like in LATAM, maybe that's what you're paying for.
Just as an example, right?
Yeah.
So $60 an hour, whereas when you work with an agency or a vendor that's able to go to handle this for you, they're able to come in at much cheaper, right? Because they already have the playbook. They've done this countless times before. They know exactly what they want to implement.
Yeah.
It's much
a lot of systems that you just plug into, and it's just you just kind of duplicate it for every customer.
Exactly. So when we're looking at it from a cost perspective, it's typically also within your best interest, especially, which we have seen, when you realize that you have to go get SOC 2 and the job posting comes up for, GRC manager or, GRC analyst or something like that, because some companies do realize that they can't do it internally. And so their immediate reaction is, well, let's go hire somebody. But there's also an option number two where you can go with a vendor that can assist you with this for something like a managed compliance service, and they can come in at much cheaper. So there is a cost component on why you would want to consider this
Yeah.
as well.
Totally. I've also seen it where you go hire a GRC person, and then the GRC person's like, well, what about all the IT stuff and the security stuff? And they're like, that's what we hired you for. And they're like, I don't do all that stuff.
I do this portion of it, right?
Yeah. I'm assuming there's people already implementing the other pieces, right? I'm like managing it from like a program perspective. The GRC person definitely isn't going into Entra ID to set up SSO for Salesforce, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of it too. Just understanding what exactly is the scope of things. That again,
Everybody's
it starts with the gap at the beginning,
Yes.
right? You don't even know what you don't know unless you can get an accurate representation of how you stack up against that thing that you're shooting for today.
Right.
So a lot of it is just taking two steps back, looking at the bigger picture. Where am I today? Where am I trying to go? How much time do I have to get there? And I would also note that when we talk about cost, a lot of companies are under the impression that, oh, I should just do this with what I have. I should do this with, the budget that I have. And so budget becomes a very big issue a lot of times when we talk to customers because they haven't planned for it. But
Right.
when you actually go through this exercise, you realize that, yeah, it does justify asking for additional budget to go and do this because of all these factors that we're talking about. So you can't just assume that because I have this line item, that's all I can spend, right? Like,
Yeah. I think it just depends on who's being tasked with the initiative, right? Like if a CEO is reaching out to you, then it's like, all right, they know everything. They're the CEO, right? But if like the IT specialist who's been in that role for 6 months and probably doesn't have a lot of influence yet because they're new to the company, they're going to be very reluctant about asking for anything. I'm just trying to do my job. I'm trying to excel. I'm not trying to the first thing I go tell my boss is, hey, by the way, this thing you hired me for, you're going to need to go spend an extra $100,000, whatever. They're going to feel pretty reluctant to have that type of conversation. So I think it has to do with a lot of the times with who's coming into the conversation. Sometimes budget's not an issue. Sometimes they're like, there's definitely no budget, right? And oftentimes the people that say that there's no budget sort of fall into one of two categories. The first category is you have no business going after these compliance frameworks in the first place because there's not a true business need. Seen it many times. We're just going after SOC 2 because all SaaS have SOC 2. Okay. That's not a good reason to go after this.
unless they determine that it's in their best interest to be proactive about it because they expect to have that conversation, right? I'm just always adding a little bit of nuance to.
Sure. The second category, which is I think the more prevalent one that I see, is I'm in IT or I'm in some sort of technical role. So IT, I'm a dev, I'm a CTO, or maybe not CTO because you're on leadership, and you simply don't know the business impact that this initiative is having on a revenue perspective for the company, and you're simply just being given the initiative and saying go implement this, but you're not given the context of because this will bring me $10 million in revenue, $1 million in revenue, $500,000 in revenue, whatever it is. And so because of that, they're thinking, oh, I can't ask for budget. I promise you, if this thing is hinging on a $2 million deal, the CEO is going to have no problem, the CFO is going to have no problem spending $100,000, $300,000, whatever the gap may be, to go secure this contract or not lose a current customer, right? And so I would say if you're listening and you're in a technical role and you are tasked with this and you don't know the business impact, the very first thing I would go do is go to the head of sales or CEO or whoever is kind of gave you this in the beginning and ask them why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? How much revenue is this going to bring? How many customers are asking for this? Is it just one? Is it two? Is it multiple? And really have an understanding of why you guys are doing this. Because you might need the budget, and it's better to come equipped and be able to say, hey, I need this. It's worth spending the money because it's going to achieve 10x, 20x, 30x multiple, right?
And I think the last aspect of this is just the opportunity cost. We've touched on it a little bit in our previous points, but say that, you can figure it out. Say that you do have the time. Say that, you're willing to sort of deal with the different moving parts and things like that. It's also important to think about what else could you be doing that better benefits the company. Most companies, unless you're like us, like your core competency is not compliance, right? So depending on where you're at and what your role is, it could just be a better use of your time not to even be worried about going in and getting across the finish line on this. It may be better to say, hey, I am a developer and we're working on, this extra feature of our tool and it's much better use of my time to be working on that than to be taking some of my day and being distracted to go and figure out this compliance thing. So you also kind of have to look at your organization in terms of, who's going to be impacted and what are other competing initiatives for this? And is it better for me to let them have focus? In the vast majority of cases, it is better to have focus, right? And just let those people do what they originally signed up for, that they're bringing excellence to your organization, rather than go and try and figure this thing out and be distracted and be dealing with these moving parts and stuff like that. So,
Totally. I mean, if you're in an organization with 50 to 200 people, let's bring it up to 500 people. Your company probably has somewhere between 10 to 20 initiatives, if not more, every year. Now, obviously, there's always going to be like a top 3, top 4, both in terms of resource allocation from like a people bandwidth perspective, but also or even on the other side from like a monetary value perspective, right? Compliance sort of falls in the category that it's both time intensive and expensive, while some other things just might be very time intensive, right? And so oftentimes you have to think about this in terms of there's going to be a lot of other competing categories. Most likely if you're going after compliance, it's probably going to be in, let's call it the top 5 for that year, because you specifically have a large revenue piece attached to this. And most likely the same people are going to be involved in multiple initiatives, right? It's never just one person owning one initiative and whatever. You're probably going to be involved in 3 or 4, maybe 5 other things that year. And so the question is, well, great, you have your normal day-to-day job, and then you're also going to probably be involved in 3 to 4 initiatives every year. Are you going to have time to lock up 3 to 5 people for the entire year, not having done this before, so it's going to take a lot longer than you thought, and then potentially risk whatever other initiatives those people were also working on that are probably also equally important?
Sure. Focus is a superpower, especially if you're going after this. Chances are you are growing and you are scaling. And so you're much better supporting that effort, right? Than worrying about going and passing this audit, right? Like you can take it over after things are set up and it's much easier to maintain. That is something that we do see happen very often, but if you've never done it before and you're currently working on other stuff that's beneficial to the organization, don't distract yourself to go chase this.
Yeah. It's completely different to inherit anything versus doing something for the first time, whether it's inheriting a program or you're inheriting a business development team or a sales team or whatever it is, or you inherit a product that you're now managing versus saying you're actually going to create a whole new product. You are going to get to CMMC level 2 for the first time. You're going to do outbound as an initiative for the first time when you've only been doing outbound. Like whatever initiative it is in any company, whenever it's something that's net new, it's always just going to be so much more painful. Obviously, there's a lot of personal growth involved, but it's not as fun when there's like a time like end date, when there's an end date and you are suddenly given a problem that is way bigger than you thought and are now overwhelmed with the sheer amount of work that needs to be done in that 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, you don't just wake up one day and be a master chef. Like you probably start off cutting carrots and then you're a sous chef and then you make your way and eventually you can run the whole show. But it's also, a good thing to outsource your compliance for the first year and sit back and watch. Yeah. And just be like, hey, like
what does world class look like?
Yeah, like what are you implementing and why are you implementing it like that? And sort of looking at somebody with expertise do it for the first time and then say, okay, I feel like I got the hang of that. Yeah, I think I have enough to sort of take it over in the following year. But you also got to look at it from that perspective, right? Like you can develop the muscle at the organization, but it's not the best idea to develop it when you're under the time crunch and the pressure expectation. It's much easier to sit back and let somebody sort of get you there first, take notes, understand, and then say, okay, now I can bring this internally. The lift is much smaller because it's already in motion. Yes, there's ongoing stuff for compliance, and it's still worthwhile outsourcing parts of that on an ongoing basis. But at least when you're first looking at it, there is a lot to be said about outsourcing it. And it's not as simple as just, well, we got to do this. Our existing team's going to take care of it, right? You have to understand the nuances and the business decision overall on whether you should take this on.